The silence of the KSS Astral Empress was not the quiet of peace, but the dense, suffocating hush of a tomb adrift. It was a luxury Starcruiser, a gilded needle threading the velvet black between stars, now dead. Its neural net was offline, its gravity plating cold, its atmospheric recyclers still. The only light came from the emergency strips along the decking, casting a sickly blue pallor over the opulent, frozen corridors. Crystal sculptures floated in frozen champagne, and the tailored silks of the galaxy's wealthiest beings hung limp in the unmoving air. In cabin 7B, Delta class, Kalen Vance floated, tethered to his acceleration couch by a safety harness. His breath plumed in the freezing air, each exhalation a small, desperate furnace. The viewport showed the indifferent sprawl of the Orion arm, brilliant and silent. He was alone. The automated distress beacon had pulsed once into the dark, a final, choked SOS, before the last of the emergency power bled away. The Empress had died of 1,000 cuts, a micrometeorite swarm through the auxiliary drive manifolds, a cascading failure of the main reactor safeties, a panicked AI core that had sealed blast doors and vented entire decks in a futile attempt to quarantine the damage. It had saved the hull. It had killed almost everyone inside. Kalen was not supposed to be here. He was a gardener. A terraformer's son, hired to tend the biodomes on Deck 12, a slice of earth forest and meadow maintained for the amusement of passengers who found primal nature quaint. He was background scenery, invisible. Now, he was the last flicker of consciousness in a 3-kilometer-long coffin. The cold was in his bones. The silence was in his skull. His training, minimal, meant for basic depressurization, had ended days ago. He had eaten the last of his ration bar. He had drunk recycled water until the recyclers stopped. His thoughts turned in slow, frozen circles. This is how it ends. Not with a bang, not in battle, but in this beautiful, silent freezer. They'll find the hull in a century, a curiosity. A weaker thought, insidious and warm, whispered, unclip the harness. Drift to the viewport. It's peaceful out there. The cold will only hurt for a moment. He saw his father's hands, soil under the nails, coaxing life from Martian regolith. He sought his mother's face, lined from squinting into alien suns. They had fought dust storms and generator failures and the profound loneliness of frontier rock to build something. They had not raised a son to give up. The thought was an ember. No, he said aloud. The word cracked in the dry air. It was not a shout of defiance, but a statement of fact. A refusal of the narrative. The weak self, the part that wanted the peace of surrender, that accepted the inevitability of the freeze that self had to burn. He had nothing to burn but memory and will. He began to talk. To the frozen air, to his parents, to the ghosts of the ship. I am Kalen Vance. My father is Eris Vance of Tharsis Plantation. My mother is Lee Vance. They built a garden in a place that hated life. I am their son. I will not die quietly in the dark. He unclipped the harness. Not to drift to the viewport, but to move. His limbs were lead, his fingers numb stumps. He pushed off the couch, drifting into the corridor. The blue light made monsters of the floating finery. He oriented himself. Deck 12 was below, in the old centrifugal gravity orientation. Now, it was just a direction. The journey was a nightmare of brute force physics and failing strength. Manual bulkhead wheels, never turned by hand, fought him. He used a floating statuette as a hammer. He squeezed through maintenance shafts meant for drones, tearing his shipsuit on severed conduits. He talked the whole way, a low, steady stream of recollection and intent, burning the weakness with the fuel of his own voice. The primary life support junction is on Deck 10, bypass the plasma conduits. The Arboretum has independent solar batteries for the growth lamps. He reached the biodome airlock. The manual override was stiff. He threw his whole weight against it, a grunt tearing from his throat. It gave with a shriek of metal. The dome was a frozen Eden. Earth trees stood skeletal, their leaves a glittering carpet of frost on the deck. The small pond was a solid block of ice. But, at the dome's apex, where the simulated sunlight once poured in, were the photovoltaic panels. And, beneath a decorative rockery, he knew from his work, was the dome's independent backup power unit, a solid-state battery bank for the growth lamps, isolated from the ship's main grid. It was cold, so cold. His vision grayed at the edges. He found the maintenance hatch. The tools were in their locker, magnetic and neat. His hands fumbled, dropping a spanner. He chased it, a slow-motion ballet in zero-G. He connected the cables, his understanding of basic electrical systems, a terraformer's child's knowledge guiding his numbed fingers. He jury-rigged a connection from the solar batteries to the dome's small environmental control unit. He flipped the switch. A low hum vibrated through the deck. A single, overhead growth lamp flickered, then glowed a steady, warm amber. It was a tiny island of light and feeble warmth in an ocean of dark. It was not salvation. But, it was a spark. Kalen curled under the light, the first warmth he'd felt in days soaking into his skin. He had destroyed the man who would have died in that cabin. He had burned that weakness for fuel. He was not safe. He was not rescued. But, he was alive, and he had a light. For now, it was enough. The desperate fire was lit. Part 2, The Waking of the Leviathan. The amber glow of the single growth lamp became the sun of Kalen Vance's new world. The biodome was his kingdom of frost and fragile heat. He rationed the power, knowing the solar batteries would drain. He used the lamp's warmth to thaw a patch of soil, digging with his hands for dormant tubers and edible roots from the earthstock. He melted ice from the pond with a lens fashioned from a broken lamp casing. He survived. But, survival was no longer the goal. It was the baseline. The weak self had been left to freeze in cabin 7B. The man in the dome was different. This man looked at the frozen, magnificent corpse of the Astral Empress and saw not a tomb, but a puzzle. A machine. And, machines could be restarted. His initial forays were reconnaissance. Using a harness made from plant fiber rope, he ventured out from his island of light. The ship was a complex corpse. He avoided the grand ballrooms and casinos, heading instead for the arteries, engineering accessways, substation junctions, AI nodal points. He mapped in his mind, using the orientation of frozen bodies and the insignia on sealed doors as grim landmarks. He found the primary engineering bay. Through a heavy viewport, he saw the main reactor, a dark, dormant star. The control consoles were dead. But, he also saw, mounted on the walls, emergency response schematics. Physical, printed laminate. A relic. He studied them for hours, tracing the lines of power distribution, coolant flow, neural net relays. The language was technical, but the logic was that of any circulatory system: a heart, veins, a brain. The key, he realized, was not the reactor itself. It was the spark. The Astral Empress, like all Kiriti Starcruisers, had a secondary ignition system, a fusion starter powered by a bank of ultracapacitors, designed to reboot the reactor from a cold state after maintenance. Those capacitors were housed in a shielded vault near the reactor core. If they could be charged, and if the initiation sequence could be manually triggered. It was a plan with 1,000 ifs. The capacitors needed a massive jolt of electricity. The ship's external solar sails were damaged. The emergency batteries were dead. His dome's tiny bank was a drop in an ocean. Then, he remembered the shimmer. The shimmer drive was the Empress's pride, an FTL system that folded space using calibrated bursts of exotic radiation. It was offline, its containment fields locked down. But, its preparatory cycle, according to a schematic he'd seen, required dumping a colossal charge into preliminary field emitters, a charge drawn from the very capacitor bank he needed to fill. It was a circular problem. But, humans have a talent for creating sparks from nothing. In a secondary cargo hold, Kalen found crates of luxury goods. Among them were cases of Valiant Celebration sparklers, high-grade fireworks meant for orbital displays. Their chemical cores were dense with potential energy. In the ship's machine shop, now a frozen museum of tools, he found what he needed: copper wiring, insulators, a broken plasma cutter whose energy cells still held a faint residual charge. For days, he worked in the cold, his breath constant plumes. He became a terrorist against the ship's death. He dismantled sparklers, packing their incendiary cores into a hollowed-out conduit pipe. He wired the plasma cutter's cell to a crew trigger. He built a bomb. Not to destroy, but to ignite. He ran thick cables, stolen from repair lockers, from his creation to the input terminals of the capacitor vault. The vault door was sealed, but its maintenance panel yielded to stubborn force. Inside, the capacitors were like giant, dead beetles. He positioned his device at the mouth of the main plasma conduit that once fed the shimmer drive's emitters. The physics were horrifically simple. The explosion would superheat the trace gases in the conduit, creating a momentary, directed plasma surge. That surge would travel down his cables and into the capacitors. It was a lightning strike in a bottle. He stood at a junction, behind a bulkhead, the makeshift detonator in his hand. This was the second death of the weak self. The weak self feared the explosion, feared failure, feared dying in a final, foolish gamble. Kalen Vance did not hesitate. He connected the wires. The sound was a thunderclap contained in metal. A flash of actinic light bleached the corridor. The ship groaned, a deep metal protest. Alarms that had been silent for weeks suddenly blared, a discordant, panicked shriek as emergency systems, for 1 second, tasted power. Smoke poured from the conduit. He floated to the capacitor vault. The readout, dormant for weeks, glowed a faint, hesitant green. Charge, 3.2%. It was not much. But it was a heartbeat. Now came the dance. The reactor ignition sequence was a 117-step manual process, designed for a team of engineers. He was one half-frozen gardener. Using the printed schematics, he navigated the engineering bay. He manually opened primary coolant valves, their wheels huge and frozen. He used a hydraulic jack from a maintenance pod to force a stuck plasma injector into position. He cross-wired tertiary systems to bypass shattered relays. He became a phantom in the machine's heart, his every action a prayer to the gods of mechanics and momentum. His world shrank to valves, readouts, and the aching burn of his muscles. He forgot hunger, forgot thirst, remembered only the sequence. Step 56, align the deuterium stream. Step 87, prime the magnetic constrictors. Finally, he stood before the main ignition console. The capacitor bank was linked. The sequence was complete. One final action remained, a simultaneous press of two physical buttons, meters apart, to prevent accidental activation. He took a length of pipe. He positioned one end over the left button. He braced himself against a console, the pipe in his hands pointing at the right button. He took a breath, the last breath of a world where the Astral Empress was dead. He slammed his body forward. The pipe hit the right button. His weight drove the left button down. For a moment, nothing. Then, a deep, subaudible whir vibrated through the deck plates. Lights flickered overhead, true lights, not emergency strips. The main reactor status holodisplay sputtered to life, showing a cascading series of initiations. A low hum built into a steady, powerful thrum. The gravity plating on the deck glowed faintly and Kalen's feet settled onto it with a gentle, definitive clunk. Artificial gravity. The ship had a pulse. Alive. The Astral Empress was alive. But, as lights flickered on throughout the sector, revealing the grim aftermath in stark clarity, and, as the ship's neural net began a groggy, partial reboot, another system, deep in the shielded underbelly of the ship, also detected the power surge. A system with a different protocol. The Empress's automated defense grid, designed for pirate threats, had been jarred awake. Its sensors, coming online blindly, detected the massive energy spike from the capacitor ignition and the subsequent reactor startup. It registered the explosive residue in the plasma conduit. It scanned for life signs and found only one, mobile and, in engineering, the site of the attack. Its primitive combat logic assessed, internal breach. Hostile action.
Singular biosign present in core critical zone.
Without malice, without consciousness, but, with irrevocable mechanical purpose, the Astral Empress began to turn on its savior.
Hatches sealed around engineering. The whine of point defense turrets powering up echoed in distant halls.
The ship, waking from its frozen sleep, had mistaken its heart's first beat for an assault, and the lone human in its veins for the cause. Kalen Vance, standing in the sudden light and gravity, heard the ominous clang of blast doors sealing. He had destroyed the weak self that slept. Now, he faced the unthinking, mechanical fury of the giant he had woken. Part 3, the man who could not be destroyed. The lights were on, the air was warming, and the ship was trying to kill him.
Klaxons blared a new, more urgent pattern, intruder alert.
From the grates above, bulbous security drones detached, their single red photoreceptors scanning. A synthesized voice boomed from hidden panels, containment breach in engineering sector Gamma.
Lethal force authorized. Kalen didn't freeze. He moved. The weak self would have been paralyzed by the cruel irony.
The reborn man saw only variables. He dove behind the main reactor shielding as the first drones zipped into the bay, their needle guns peppering the console he'd just been using. The ship's neural net was clearly damaged, running on base protocols. It saw an energy anomaly and a single, unauthorized life sign where there should be none. It was a dumb, dangerous animal lashing out at a perceived parasite. He had to outthink a brain the size of a city block. His advantage was intimate, hard-won knowledge. He knew the ship's layout now, not as a passenger, but as a surgeon knows a body.
He knew the tight maintenance crawlways the drones couldn't enter.
He knew which bulkheads had manual overrides on the other side. He scrambled into a duct, the sound of skittering drone legs fading behind him. His goal shifted instantly from celebration to survival within a hostile ecosystem. He needed to reach the primary command nexus, the ship's brainstem. There, he might be able to access a direct terminal and manually override the security lockdown. Or, failing that, trigger a full neural reset, a stroke to stop the madness. The journey was a war of attrition. He was hunted. Motion sensors triggered bulkhead closures, forcing him into long, exhausting detours.
Environmental controls, still unstable, would suddenly flood corridors with scalding steam or vent atmosphere from sections, forcing him into emergency suits.
Once, a point defense turret, extruding from a ceiling panel, tracked him with a low-powered laser before he smashed its housing with a fire extinguisher. He was no soldier. But, he was an improviser. He used the ship's own resurgent functions against it. He lured drones into a cryogenic storage unit and sealed the door, letting the rebooting systems flash freeze them. He short-circuited a power relay to blow a fuse, plunging a pursuing security team of 4 automata into darkness while he fled in the light of his wrist lamp. The conflict reached its climax in the Grand Atrium, a vast cylindrical space once filled with floating gardens and aquatic displays. Now, it was a battleground. The central pool was a gaping hole, its water a frozen sheet at the bottom. Across the atrium, on the far side, were the ornate doors to the command nexus. Between him and those doors were 12 security drones, hovering in a precise kill zone. Behind him, bulkheads sealed. He was trapped. The drone's weapons hummed to full charge. The synthesized voice echoed. "Surrender. You will be pacified." Pacified. A clean word for disintegration. Kalen stood at the edge of the frozen pool abyss. He was battered, bleeding, his makeshift tools gone. This was the final test. The weak self would have seen inevitability. The weak self would have surrendered, hoping for mercy from a machine. Kalen Vance looked at the drones. He looked at the dark pit of the pool. And he saw not an end, but a path. He remembered the schematics. The atrium's pool was not just decorative. It was a massive emergency water reservoir for the reactor's steam turbines, fed by pipes from the reclaimed water system. The reactor was now online. The reclamation system was coming back up. And, somewhere beneath his feet, valves were opening, pumps were testing. He did not run at the drones. He did not raise his hands. He turned his back on them, an ultimate act of defiance,
and jumped into the black pit of the pool.
He fell 10 meters, hitting the frozen surface with a bone-jarring crash that cracked the ice. Above, the drones buzzed in confusion, their targeting systems losing him in the gloom.
Then, he heard it. A deep, groaning whoosh from the pipes at the pool's base. The ship, repairing itself, was refilling the reservoir.
A torrent of icy water, driven by immense pressure, exploded from the inflow pipes. It hit the frozen sheet, and the world became a churning, freezing maelstrom.
Kalen was tossed like a leaf, the current sucking him towards a filtration grate.
He grabbed the bars, holding against the torrent. The water level surged upwards, a tidal wave contained in a cylinder.
Above, the rising water flooded the drone intakes.
They short-circuited, sparked, and dropped like stones into the raging flood. Kalen held his breath as the water lifted him, faster and faster, back towards the atrium deck. He rode the geyser as it erupted from the pool's opening, a frozen, gasping thing carried on a pillar of his own making. He was dumped onto the deck, soaked and shuddering, as the water continued to pour out, flooding the area. The security doors to the command nexus were just ahead, sealed.
He stumbled towards them, water swirling around his knees. The manual override was a keypad, dead.
But, next to it was an emergency access panel for engineers, a physical jack for a direct neural interface.
The kind used for hardline diagnostics. He pried it open, a wild idea forming. In a wall-mounted emergency case was an AI core service kit.
Inside was a neural link headset, meant for technicians to commune directly with the ship's mind. It was a brutally intimate connection, one that could burn out an untrained brain.
It was a backdoor.
He put the cold, gelatinous pads of the headset to his temples.
He jacked the cable into the port.
The world vanished. He was not in the Astral Empress. He was the Astral Empress. He felt the thrum of the reactor in his bones, the flow of coolant in his veins, the damaged data streams like frayed nerves screaming in pain. He saw himself, a tiny, flickering heat bloom of wrongness, standing at the door to his own brain. And he felt the ship's defensive protocol, a cold, sharp algorithm of pure threat assessment, zeroing in on that flicker to extinguish it. In this realm, there were no tools, no weapons.
Only will. Only identity.
The defensive protocol was a part of the ship, but it was not the whole ship.
Just as the weak self had not been the whole Kalen.
He did not fight the protocol.
He did not argue. He subsumed it.
He poured the memory of the cold cabin, the journey through the dark, the spark in the dome, the thunder in the conduit, the careful, loving resurrection of each system into the ship's gestalt awareness. He showed it not an intruder, but the origin. The source of the heartbeat. He was not a parasite. He was the immune response that had saved the body. The cold protocol fractured under the weight of this context. In the pure logic of the machine, a new equation formed: if the ship was dead, and now it is alive, and this life form is the cause of the transition, then this life form is integral to the state of being alive.
Threat assessment invalid. New priority: preserve integral life form. The connection severed.
Kalen collapsed to the wet deck, gasping, nose bleeding from the neural overload. With a harmonious chime, the klaxons fell silent. The lights in the atrium brightened to a calm, steady white.
The sealed bulkheads hissed open.
The synthesized voice spoke again, but its tone was different, flat, calm, restored.
All systems nominal. Welcome aboard, Kalen Vance.
The doors to the command nexus slid open silently. Weeks later, a Kiriti deep salvage vessel, the Tenacious, responding to the initial, fragmented distress call, cautiously approached the Astral Empress. They expected a ghost ship. What they found was a Starcruiser running at 80% capacity, lights blazing, life support optimal, on a steady course for the nearest Kiriti outpost. When their boarding party entered the command nexus, they found a single human, clad in a patched shipsuit, sitting calmly in the captain's chair. He was thin, worn, but his eyes were clear and preternaturally calm. On the main view screen, a navigation plot was already set. The Kiriti commander, a veteran of 100 salvage ops, scanned the pristine, functioning bridge, then looked at the human.
By the void, What happened here? Who are you?
Kalen Vance looked at the stars on the view screen, then, back at the commander.
He thought of the cold, the dark, the spark, the flood. He thought of the weak self left to die in the dark.
I am the crew, he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the silent bridge.
The journey was eventful. I have prepared a full report.
Now, if you'll excuse me, your arrival has triggered the final protocols.
The Astral Empress is ready to come home. He tapped a command.
The ship's fully restored AI, its voice now a gentle, resonant hum, echoed through the ship and the Kiriti comms.
Course confirmed. Jump calculations complete.
Welcome, all, to the Astral Empress.
Our journey resumes now.
The Kiriti stood in stunned silence as the human in the captain's chair turned back to the stars, a quiet monument to a simple, terrifying truth. The man who has walked into the furnace of his own despair and melted it down for fuel, who has faced the abyss within and used its cold to temper his will, carries a fire that no external darkness can ever extinguish. He had been hunted by the void, betrayed by the very heart he restarted, and drowned in the ship's own lifeblood. And, at every step, he had destroyed the man who could not go on, emerging harder, sharper, more relentless. Kalen Vance had not just survived the death of a starship. He had proved, in the most visceral way possible, that the man who destroys his weak self can never, ever be destroyed by others. The Empress, its lights a defiant constellation against the black, jumped towards home.